Hi, my name is Frances McNamara, and this video is just to introduce you to the Nutshell Murder Mystery Series. Book 1 is Molasses Murder in a Nutshell. Molasses Murder in a Nutshell. That's a picture of me, so you don't have to look at me as I am now. This first book takes place during the Boston Molasses flood in January 1919. That's a real historical event. It includes real historical characters, but we're imagining what was it like to be there at that time. I'm going to talk about what's real and what isn't real. I always put an afterword in my books that talks about that too. And then I'm going to talk about some other books that I've written and what's next. So the title Nutshell Studies comes from an old saying in law enforcement. The purpose of a forensic investigation is said to be convict the guilty, clear the innocent, and find the truth in a nutshell. A great structure for a story, especially a mystery story. So we're starting with the historical event, Boston Molasses flood, January 1919. It was midday. A molasses tank flooded in the north end of Boston. So this is what the tank looked like before it blew up. It was in 1917, we had gotten into the war, and molasses was shipped up from the Caribbean, offloaded from the ships into this tank, and then it would be piped out to trucks that took it to Cambridge, where it was processed. It was used for making armaments for World War I. Now, in January 1919, the war had just come to an end. And that day, suddenly it exploded. It took away at least one building, and it broke down part of the overhead, the L track here. 21 people were killed. At least one tenement building swept away. For years, people thought that they smelled molasses in the North End. It was a mess. Now, a great source for the facts that I used is Stephen Pulleo's Dark Tide, The Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. This is a great book. If you're interested in the story, I certainly was inspired by it, and it gives you lots of facts about what happened. So it just so happens that Frances Glessner Lee, who became known as the mother of forensic science, was in Boston at the same time. And I was interested in her since I had visited the Glessner house in Chicago, and I had a friend who was a docent there. And she came from a wealthy family in Chicago. She was divorced in 1914, and this is 1919, and that was a little unusual at that time. She was a friend to the medical examiner in Boston, Dr. George Magrath. Well, eventually, she worked on forensics to such an extent that she became known as the mother of forensic science, and this is when she's older. She's particularly remembered for the 20 nutshell studies she created between 1945 and 1948, and this is probably at that time when she was working on them in her estate up in New Hampshire. But down in Boston, at Harvard, there were seminars in homicide investigation that used these nutshell studies, these little crime scenes, and they trained detectives from all over the country. They ran them from 1946. They actually sometimes still run them now in Maryland, not in Harvard anymore. And they were held twice a year, and a lot of detectives were trained with them. A couple of more great nonfiction descriptions of this are the Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death by Corinne May Botts, which have actual pictures of all of the little crime scenes and information from them. Now, they weren't real crimes. They were meant to train investigators, and they were based on what she had learned about crimes, working with her friend, Dr. Magrath, but they weren't based on specific crimes and they did not have specific solutions. So this is a great kind of thing to start with if you're a storyteller and you want to write a fictional story. So the idea of the series will be to take one of these and weave a fictional story around it. 18 Tiny Deaths by Bruce Goldfarb is very interesting, tells you a lot about Frances Glessner Lee's career. She approached it, and you'll see that in the first book, she actually thought she was a rich woman. People saw her as a rich woman who didn't have enough to do with her time. And she really wanted to contribute something. And she got involved in forensic science. She became obsessed with it and contributed greatly to forensic science. Now, what happened was she inherited money in about 1930. So this book is set in 1919, but later she inherits money. And she had been working with her friend, Dr. George Magrath, who was the medical examiner. So she invested in the Department of Legal Medicine at Harvard University. She funded a chair in a library. The first one to hold the chair was George Magrath. And as part of working with the Department of Legal Medicine, the seminars started from 1945 to present. And most of the time they were run twice a year. And she was particularly interested in having a medical examiner versus a political coroner, which it had been through history an elected coroner who went to a death scene. But medical examiner systems were taking over. They haven't totally everywhere now, but she was very interested in promoting medical examiners as opposed to coroners. So starting with one of the nutshell studies, I chose the dark bathroom. So the book starts with a fictional character coming to find her sister in a tenement. She finds her sister dead in a bathroom, and suddenly the whole building gets swept away by the Molasses flood. So that's this is a picture from the Karen Blatt's book, and this is from the 18 Tiny Deaths. These little crime scenes are still at the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office. They were renovated, repaired by Smithsonian Institute a few years ago, and that was the only time they were available for view, but they are still at the medical examiner's office. And Bruce Goldfarb, who wrote the 18 Tiny Deaths book, has a wonderful video that talks about the nutshell studies and Frances Glessner Lee. Now, Dr. George Magrath is another real historical character in the book. He went to Harvard with Lee's brother and was a friend. He was medical examiner in Boston, Suffolk County from 1907 to 1935. He died in 1936. He taught in the medical school at Harvard, legal medicine, it was known as, and later became known as forensics. Some of the important cases he was involved in were the Summer Street Bridge, murders in 16 and 27 and 31, and the 1921 trial of Sacco and Vanzetti. He was quite a character around town. He had a Ford Model T that was tricked out with lights and alarms and sirens, and he would drive that around and arrive at crime scenes. So he was quite an interesting character too. Another real person in the book is Rose Standish Nichols. She lived on Beacon Hill. This is her house, the Nichols house. At one point, I was giving tours at the Nichols house, and it's a wonderful place to visit. She came from a wealthy family in Boston. She never married. She was a pacifist, worked with Jane Addams, who was against war, and she was an activist in various things, including suffragist to get the vote for women. She also had a profession as a landscape designer, and she did hold salons in her parlor, which were meeting places where people could have discussions. And she didn't feed them too much because she really just wanted them to have discussions. So she's a wonderful character. Have no reason to believe she really did meet Frances Glessner Lee, but in the books, fictionally, they come together. So imagining history, writing historical mysteries involves combining real events and people with fictional events and people. So the real things in this story are there really was that Molasses tank flood on January 15th. Frances Glessner Lee really was in Boston in 1919. She was running a home for returning soldiers that was called Wendell House. It was up on Beacon Hill, at the corner of Hancock Street and Mount Vernon Street, so only a couple of blocks away from Nichols' house, where Rose Nichols lived. This is a picture of some of the men in front of the building. This is inside, which she was proud that she made it homey for them. It was where they could stop before they tried to go home, since they found that with the flu epidemic and everything else, sometimes it took a little while to locate the families and the homes that they wanted to go back to. Rose Nichols really did hold salons where people discussed current affairs in her house. Dr. Magrath did the autopsies for the Molasses tank flood and many other things. This is a picture of the mortuary on Grove Street. And anarchists were suspected of having blown up the tank because there had been an anarchist explosion at the Salutation Street police station in before that, and that police station was in the North End. Not real, the things that are imagined. First of all, the timing. I have these set in the 1920s. These books are going to be set where I'm imagining that when she came back to Wendell House, Frances Glessner Lee, she might have met up with her brother's old friend, and that might have sparked her interest in forensic study. In most descriptions of it, it seems like in 1929 was really when Frances Glessner Lee and George Magrath were in Massachusetts General Hospital recovering from some surgery. And that was when she became involved with him. And of course, actually creating the nutshell studies didn't happen until the 1940s, when I'm going to have her creating them as she goes along here. The murdered woman and the lovers and the husband in the book, those are all fictional characters. The specific Rose Nichols meetings are fictional. So this is a picture of her with her reading group. Later in her life, she was only in her 40s when the books take place. She really did have meetings like that, but there are two specific meetings in the book that are totally fictional. Cornelia Thornwell, a Beacon Hill matron in the books, is also fictional and borrowed from Upton Sinclair's book about the Sacco Vanzetti trials, which was called Boston. Henry Cabot Lodge was senator and was known for his anti-immigrant feelings, but he was not on the board of Wendell House, and that's just pulled in for dramatic effect. And the Italian anarchists who were characters in the book are totally fictional. So imagining history involves combining the real and the not real, taking all those elements together and combining them like a recipe to make a story. And your story is going to be about what was it really like at the time. And the interesting one here is, why would a woman like Frances Glessner Lee want to end up making death miniatures to train detectives? So we follow her and ask that question, and she's thinking about that kind of thing as we go along. It's fun for the now and then. So today's places always impress me. So the Molasses tank, this is from the day after, and they knew 11 were dead. There were actually 21 dead. But the North End now, there's a nice park where this took place. In the North End, I have a a nephew who has a condo in the North End, and it turned out his building at this time was called the Florence Hotel. It had a restaurant on the bottom, and people lived in it, and I used that in the book. The Charles Street Jail is in the book. This is what it looked like at the time. Right now, it's the Liberty Hotel, and we go there for brunch and drinks. On the Esplanade, there's the Union Boating Club, and this is what it looked like at the time. You can still walk down to the Esplanade and see it. The Nichols House on Beacon Hill is still there, and you can take a tour of it. So it's fun to think about what it was really like in those places in the past. Imagining history, I've done this before with the 9 books of the Emily Cabot mysteries. So I'm just going to mention how they also imagine history. In this case, the protagonist and the police detective she works with are both totally fictional characters, unlike the Nutshell mysteries where they're real historical characters of the main detectives. But Emily Cabot is a young woman from Boston who comes to be one of the first women graduate students at the University of Chicago in 1893, 1892. And in the first book is during the Columbian Exposition. She meets Ida B. Wells in that, a real historical character. Death at Hull House, she works with Jane Addams and Florence Kelly, who are real historical people. In that book, Pullman is about the Pullman strike and has real characters. Death at Woods Hole, I actually have a house on Cape Cod, so I have visited the Marine Biological Laboratory and come to find out in 1894, the scientists from the University of Chicago were very much involved in there. So I brought the Emily Cabot imaginary person to here, and she works with real historical characters, including a woman from Mount Holyoke College, which is my where I went to school, who was at Woods Hole at that time as a scientist. Death in Chinatown includes 2 real young Chinese women who got medical degrees from the University of Michigan. And in 1896, that summer, they were in Chicago, and then they went back to China. So the fictional story is built in that summer where people don't know what they were doing in Chicago. Death at the Paris Exposition takes place in 1900. Bertha Palmer, a society woman in Chicago, takes Emily Cabot and she's Chapman now, and her family to Paris. She meets the artist Mary Cassatt, among other real people. Death at Selig Studios includes a real studio for silent movies. There were several real studios in Chicago at the time, and this one includes the Selig Studios. Death at the Homefront is set in 1917. Emily's children have grown up, and she has 2 sons and a daughter, and they're we're on the point of war. She's a pacifist with Jane Addams, but has to face the reality that they're being drawn into the war, and her daughter's best friend is murdered. Death in a Time of Spanish Flu is the fall of 1918, when flu struck Chicago, and her children are pulled into a fictional murder trial that is roughly based on a real one from earlier in time. And then there's an ebook that's the first 4 books put together. So I hope you'll try Molasses Murder in a Nutshell, which is only the first of the Nutshell murder mysteries, and enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.